The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Let's pick up the conversation from the voicemail on the regular show about ranked choice voting and Starbucks founder Howard Schultz possibly running as an independent. If there's something that can unify Democrats right now, it seems to be doing everything possible to prevent Donald Trump from being reelected in 2020. And it's so funny, Pat, because as soon as Howard Schultz said, I may run as an independent, as a sort of socially liberal, independently minded centrist, or whatever phraseology he's applied to it, Democrats have come out almost totally unanimously saying, yeah, that's going to help Donald Trump reelected. And I agree with the system that we have without ranked choice voting, just having a first past the post system, Howard Schultz could lead to Donald Trump's reelection unnecessarily, possibly.
Maybe. It depends on who the Democrats choose as their nominee. I feel like if there was any time where an independent party candidate would play spoiler, it would have been in 2016. And even though Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, they got some percentage of the vote, I don't think they ultimately handed the election to Trump. I think it was more of Hillary Clinton being a bad candidate that did it. So I'm not worried so much about him playing spoiler as much as just the candidate, the campaign that he's running. It's pretty lowly, I think.
Yeah, I'm not super interested in Howard Schultz's candidacy. I would take a little bit of issue with one thing you said about the 2016 campaign. Campaigns, ultimately, when you have 120 million or 130 million people who vote, which I think is roughly the number that voted in 2016, and it comes down to 77,000 votes in 3 states, ultimately, that could have flipped it. We know that there was Russian interference. We know that the DNC was involved in ways that maybe were damaging in general to the Democratic Party. We know that Hillary Clinton was lacking as a candidate. We know that there were third-party candidates. I don't think we can say this one factor was not a difference maker. I think that a lot of those things could have actually made a difference. But the more important thing is, it never should have been so close that would have flipped it. In other words, I haven't looked closely at the Gary Johnson, Jill Stein numbers. It actually is possible that in some close states, maybe those votes could have flipped the election. But I still think it's legitimate to say this is not an election that should ever have been so close.
Yeah, I mean, you never really know is the truth, because maybe some of those Jill Stein voters, you'd imagine they definitely line up more with Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, but they may have just stayed home instead of voting for Jill Stein. So in retrospect, there are so many different things that could have flipped the election. Maybe this is one of them, but we'll never know for sure.
What's important here is, I think if Howard Schultz wants to run as a Republican or as a Democrat, although I can't imagine he'd run as a Republican, because this is not an election to play games with. That's sort of the only way I can really say it. And if he does run, I would love to have him on the program and we can ask him why Starbucks coffee is so terrible. That's really the only, I don't have that many political questions for Howard Schultz, but I would love to find out a little bit about how he ended up with this dark roast to the point of being burnt Starbucks coffee. And maybe he'll have an answer for us.
Well, most of the country, I think, would disagree with you, especially those who live in Seattle and those who live in New York. That's why I'm actually a little bit worried that maybe he'll pick up a following. Although ultimately, I don't think that's going to happen. He's been ridiculed right off the bat, and I think that he's going to end up dropping out pretty soon.
I think you're probably right, but Seattle is like a hub of third wave coffee. So you have pro-Starbucks sentiment in Seattle, but you also have massive anti-Starbucks sentiment because they have some of the most hipster anti-Starbucks coffee shops there. Although I've never been. I look forward to visiting Seattle someday, but I've never been.
I thought that the 2020 election would be a referendum on President Trump. It turns out it may just be a referendum on Starbucks coffee.
It's going to be a referendum on light roast versus dark roast. That's for sure. I look forward. I look forward to participating in that battle of ideas for sure. Okay, PG&E, which is the owner of the largest U.S. power utility, has filed for bankruptcy protection yesterday in anticipation of liabilities in excess of $30 billion as a result of the deadliest wildfires in California's history. These are the ones that Donald Trump said all sorts of crazy things about that that's not what we're talking about today. We don't have to go back to that. It's just a reminder. They are saying that the power and the gas is going to remain on They're not going out of business. There's not going to be a disruption to the services that people get from PG&E, but that they anticipate a massive, massive upside down balance sheet situation because of this $30 billion in liability. So there's a couple different things here that I think are important. One is these utilities have been deregulated in some ways over the last many years, but they are still one of the most highly regulated businesses, entities, types of entities in the United States for good reason, because electricity and gas and heating are just so important to maintaining just a basic standard of living in the United States. We should completely take these companies out of the realm of the sort of corporate complex, and let's just make them government institutions. Nobody's happy, generally speaking, with these companies. They're sort of like cable providers in many ways, very, very low approval and customer satisfaction already, financially insolvent in more and more cases around the country. I say that we just bite the bullet, Pat, and say, you know what, like healthcare, like education, like so many other things, we should just have a totally different paradigm when it comes to getting people gas and electricity, and let's make it a government-run thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are some goods and services that we want in the hands of the private sector. It makes sense for the free market to dictate what's the best shoe or what's the best car. But when it comes to things that are vital to our health and well-being and sustainability, things like healthcare, things like education, and utilities, I think that should be in the public sector. So I'd have to agree with you there.
And case in point, you have now people who are financially invested in PG&E saying this announcement is reckless because it's going to be bad for shareholders, and now this is going to be take it out of this paradigm altogether. Let's just step aside, manage this in a completely different way. Now, that is not without fault, right? So you can look at countries where the utilities are owned and operated by governments. It's not always ginger snaps and waterfalls, right? Like there are sometimes problems. I'm not denying that reality. But you first just have to figure out what should be outside of profit motive and not run like a business, but rather run as a public service, as something, as part of the commons, as something that everybody should have access to. And I think increasingly utilities are that. And, you know, there's people even talking about at this point, not about taking internet access out of the for-profit world, but of saying that it is effectively like a utility, like phone, for example, and that internet service providers are, as we've talked about before, common carriers. And I completely agree with that. And we'll see ultimately what happens here with PG&E. And of course, I hope that Trump doesn't even consider getting involved in commenting on this, because every single bit of participation he's had in this entire California wildfire fiasco has just been objectively destructive and embarrassing. Here's something interesting. When we have a mass shooting that takes place or a horrible criminal act, the number one priority, of course, is to end the threat as soon as possible. When it comes to mass shootings, many times it ends with the shooter shooting themselves, or as is typically the case, himself. But very quickly, we get to questions of motive. What inspired the shooter to take these actions? What happened in the shooter's life? What was it? Was this a political statement? Was it merely mental illness, as is sometimes said? When it comes to the Las Vegas shooter, the FBI has been investigating motive for more than a year at this point, and they have been unable to find any single or clear motivating factor which drove Stephen Paddock to go on this rampage and kill a whole bunch of people in Las Vegas and ultimately to take his own life. And yesterday, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit shared their findings from the report, and they said that they looked at interpersonal history, clinical history, developmental history. They looked at his online sort of footprints, and it seems as though either the motive is unclear and or Stephen Paddock simply did a very good job at hiding evidence of what that motive is. And this may be as far as we get, Pat. We may simply never know.
Yeah, it's very sad because whenever one of these tragic events happen, we want to get some form of closure. And knowing the motive of the perpetrator, I think, helps to some degree and can prevent future criminal acts from occurring. It may just be that Paddock was suicidal and was a terrible enough person to also want to take out the lives of countless other people, ending up shooting dozens of people on his way out. That could just be it. Also, his father was a fugitive, a bank robber in the 60s, and was on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. Maybe there was some sort of influence there. Maybe he wanted to live up to his father's reputation. We'll really just never know, and that's unfortunate.
And also unfortunate is that the lack of clear motive. This is just, we've got our piece on conspiracy theories coming out next week. The lack of a clear motive is reinvigorating the conspiracy theorists to say, doesn't make sense, no motive. Wouldn't any seriously put together conspiracy theory at least plant a motive? Like this is an example of how evidence for or lack of evidence both count as supporting the conspiracy theory that's laid out. If this actually was a guy who was set up to take the fall or controlled with psychiatric medications and encouraged to go and do this, whatever conspiracy theory you subscribe to, wouldn't the people who pulled it off have been smart enough to at least plant a motive? Maybe,
but I think the conspiracy theory is that this was a false flag so that the government would have an excuse to confiscate guns. Now, that doesn't really make sense because this occurred when Trump was president and Republicans had total control, so that was never going to happen. But you don't, if that's the motive for the government perpetrating a conspiracy to take away people's guns, you don't need a personal motive for Stephen Paddock necessarily.
Well, but if you want to make it, if you're actually planning this in advance, then why wouldn't you, in addition to all of the other details you would have to set up, leave a note somewhere? Say, look, we found an email where he explained why he's doing this. He's doing it to protest this or that action by the government or whatever. You would plant something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that could be true. I've never manufactured any sort of conspiracy myself, so I don't really know. But I'd have to imagine I would leave a note at least.
I'm not an expert conspiracy planner either, but what I'm thinking is if I were to do this, I would leave a note somewhere. I would create some kind of paper trail. Okay, that's it for today. New show, new bonus show tomorrow, and then on the Friday bonus show, we will hear about Pat's upcoming vacation.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.